Welcome, everyone, to the July 2024 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. My name is Judy Flattery, and I am the president of the society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, 100% volunteer run, been around since around the mid-90s. If you care to join us as a membership or do a donation, there's our QR code for PayPal. And we welcome anyone who's interested in humanism or the topics that we talk about. Today, my husband Dave and myself will be talking about Judy and Dave's prison adventure. Over the past year, we have visited 8 of the 32 California state prisons and wanted to share something of our journey along the way of what we've learned. Prior to this time period, we didn't know very much about jails or prisons. Our knowledge was informed by watching the Andy Griffith show as kids, taking the boat over to Alcatraz, watching Shawshank Redemption, noticing those signs along some California highways that tell you there's a state prison coming up, don't pick up any hitchhikers. We're pretty much uninformed, out of touch, and oblivious. It was really prisons, out of sight, out of mind. And we've come to a real awakening that we wanted to share with you. We have a member of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. His name is Johnny Mora. He's been a member since March of 2022, and he started writing us letters since about March of that year. He writes to us about his life, his hopes, his fears, and every month we send him our newsletter and other humanist-related publications. He's in his early 50s. He's been incarcerated for over 25 years. And this got me wondering about prison life and curious and interested about it. Johnny sent us this picture of himself. He wanted to make sure that we knew that, yes, he's a humanist, he's an atheist. You can tell by looking at his neck tattoos. So that interest in what's going on with Johnny, that interest in prisons led to talking to the Southern California Secular Coalition. HSSB is a member of that coalition. They were looking for a theme for their 2022 conference, and I suggested, what about looking at life behind bars, compassion and reform? Let's put together a day-long program on that. And in the process of identifying speakers, getting speakers, listening to what they had to say, editing their videos, I learned a lot and came to care a lot about prisons and prison reform. Dave?
Just as introduction, I'm Dave Flattery. I'm the treasurer of the Humanist Society, and I have been Judy's partner, as you can tell from the title, in these prison adventures, and have done some of my own work to try and understand the data behind prisons, sort of how do we look at the landscape of prisons and make comparisons, and what can we learn from that? So I'll share a little bit about that, sort of the background around prisons. And the main metric that we use to look at prisons in societies is incarceration rate, which is the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 of the population. So this graph is the 11 most populous countries. I have the world on there too, so that took up a slot. So instead of 12, it's 11. And you can see the U.S. is on there. That's this dark red line, and it's clearly very displaced from the global average and from the other countries on this list. And we'll dig into that a lot more in the next few slides. There's a global number on here, which is the bold black line. That's the overall global. How much does it, in terms of Earth, at what rate do we incarcerate people? And it's been growing. It's statistically significant, but it's very slowly growing. But you can see there's some big changes in countries, right? Things change in countries, and incarceration rate seems to be one of the responses. Russia's incarceration rate has gone about in half since 2000. Brazil's has tripled, and Indonesia's has actually quadrupled. And so those are some of the lines that are real slanty on here, are those countries. And then you have, as you'll see in the next couple slides, a lot of countries down here in the 0 to 200 range, which is, normal is the right word, but it's typical. So who has the highest incarceration rates, those were just, the top 11 countries by population. But the top 25 countries with population over 1 million, so mid-sized to large countries, are here. El Salvador, actually just recently, just in the last year or so, had a very big increase in the reported incarceration rate, and they have the highest incarceration rate. U.S. is 5th right now in the world in terms of the highest incarceration rate. And interestingly, I wouldn't have expected, when we look at it regionally, where are these top 25 countries? Almost half of them are in the Americas, South America, Central America, and of course, U.S. and North America. There are 6 in Asia, none in East Asia, but in Western, Central, and Southeast Asia. In Africa, there are 5 of them that are highlighted on there. And then in Europe, there are just 2. They're both in Eastern Europe, and it's Russia and Belarus. Certainly none in Western, Northern, or Southern Europe, other than the top 25. A lot of those countries seem a lot different than the U.S. So one way I attempted to look at what's our incarceration rate compared to who should be our peer countries. And I did that with Human Development Index, which is a very widely used index published by the UN. People talk about the developing world. It's countries with a low Human Development Index from the UN. And it's made up of income, life expectancy, and educational attainment. So I call it the Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Index. But it looks at the overall development and prosperity sort of a society. And so when I plot all the countries with a Human Development Index over 0.85, which is in the highly developed range for the UN, and plot them at the intersection of their Human Development Index and their incarceration rate, they all fall into a pretty, expected kind of group in a similar range, with one exception, and that exception is the U.S. So the U.S. incarceration rate is way outside of the 99% confidence interval, where we would expect, there's only a 1% chance that a country that belonged to this group would be outside of this interval. We're like a 10-foot tall person. Something's different that's making us very high. And it isn't all that hard to find out at least a clue about what that involves. And that is when we take the data for incarceration rate, and data are published by race and ethnicity also, and we look at Black Americans versus white Americans, the white Americans' incarceration rate ends up right in the middle of that cluster, just like the rest of the developed world that we consider our peers. But the Black Americans' incarceration rate is extremely elevated. It's higher than any. So there is something going on, and it's more complex, I think, than just racism, but there's something going on that's systematic and built in that's disadvantaging Black Americans in terms of the likelihood that they're going to be incarcerated. And it's not just an American phenomenon. The countries that publish both racial segmentation for subgroups in their countries, along with their incarceration data, where I can make the comparison, I've done that where I'm confident in the data. And so here are 4 countries, and in each one of them, there's a disadvantaged racial subgroup with a very significantly elevated incarceration rate. And that inequity is observed even when the disadvantaged subgroup is the majority. This is the case in South Africa, where it's about 89% majority. That subgroup is incarcerated at almost 3 times a higher rate than the white subgroup. And we can see that across states as well. The graph on the right is the states ranked in order in terms of the ratio of the incarceration rate for their Black populace versus their white populace. And, it goes from New Jersey, which is almost 12. You can see California there is 4th on the list in terms of that ratio, down to Hawaii, which is only 2.4. So a very similar range that we see globally, we can see even just among the states. This is a quote that Judy found that I like. It's a little ironic. The law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal bread. It points to the systematicity of the mechanism that's driving this. And it hasn't always been like this. Data that are reliable enough to really calculate incarceration rates are kind of hard to find the farther back in time you go. But there have been some studies that publish a defensible data set that spans from 1940 to 2020. And when you look at it, up until the mid-70s or so, we had an incarceration rate in the U.S. that's very much in line with what the developed world experiences today. And then things changed, and the incarceration rate skyrocketed, a little over quadrupled from where it used to be. And we have what's now been retroactively labeled as mass incarceration phenomena. And there are a number of things that people cite. I don't profess to understand all of it, but things like the war on drugs, three strikes laws, changes in sentencing laws making things mandatory, the absence of mental health services, the prison industrial complex, fiscal interests that I'll talk about on the next slide, and then the list goes on. But there are many different things that seem to come together in this era, and it's starting to ebb. So you can see we peaked, as I mentioned, up until 3 years ago, we had the highest incarceration rate in the world, and now we're fifth. Our incarceration rate is decreasing, and it's been doing that for over 10 years. It's been going down. So just a little diversion about that whole prison industrial complex fiscal interest thing. So as we have been going to prisons, we've certainly, for me, it was something I just didn't understand or know about, but there is a web of infrastructure, a whole ecosystem of companies that have grown up around our incarceration system, have profited a lot from mass incarceration, and maybe some inertia that it's good to be aware of if we're trying to recover from that. But information systems, phone calls, even databases, some states outsource their databases about incarcerated people and sentences. Some states hire external firms to scan all the incoming mail so it can be delivered electronically, which reduces the contraband being introduced from soaking the paper in fentanyl or something. Money, you want to send money to a prisoner, there are companies that'll do it and they'll take a fee for that. Most states, there are only a few or even just one company that's qualified and certified to send packages in. Again, contraband issues. There's a significant private prison industry in the U.S., not so big in California, but in some states it's quite significant. And the last one here is one that I found interesting. Texas has a fan direct program where they have a process for incarcerated people to purchase fans from Texas because so many of their prisons aren't air conditioned, but they will sell you a fan. These are incarceration rates by state, and you can see that also varies a lot. Louisiana is up here a little bit over 1,000. California is in about the 40th percentile, and then Massachusetts is the lowest, about 241. And then the graph under that mixes those two, the first one with the 25 highest incarceration rate countries, and then the states that have a population over 1 million as the countries were selected. And you can see they just feather together. So basically our states span this almost identical range of the 25 highest incarceration rate countries, and California is here in the middle, and it remains, and these are current data after the decrease I mentioned. So let's zoom in on a little bit more on California. So we can see in the trend that the population over time had a similar profile to what we saw in the US one. So it went up through the 80s and then began coming down kind of at the end of the knots in 2000s. And it's not back to where it started, but it's coming down. So there are about 92,000 people in state custody right now. This is the June 30th population report. The design capacity of the prisons that they're in is about 78,000, 79,000. The budget that we spend on the overall CDCR, which includes parole, although the vast majority of the budget is on people that are in custody, is about $1.45 billion. That's the 24-25 budget. And on this graph, there are two lines, one for prison, one for jails, just for the vocabulary distinctions, jails are local facilities, city or county, generally short term, where people are during their trial until they're sentenced. Prisons, state and federal institutions, longer term, and post-conviction and post-sentencing for prisons. The definition of incarceration rate that's used by the UN and the DOJ and everybody is jails plus prison. So for the US, it's jails, prison, and federal prison. So how well are they working? So they do publish, California publishes every year a recidivism report that looks at what has happened to the population that was released 3 years ago over the last 3 years. So that's the time horizon for their recidivism analysis. So the data that are plotted here are the fraction of the released population that returns to prison within 3 years of their release date by release date. So for the people released in 2003, almost 70% of them returned to prison within 3 years, which is really an enormous fraction. That has decreased a lot in the last few years, and now it's just under 20% that return to prison within the first 3 years of being released. So it's a very good improvement. It's still very, very much elevated from the general population, which from the latest time it was that I was able to get a calculation, that the lifetime risk for somebody to go to prison ever is about 1 in 50. It's about 2% of people ever go to prison. So the fact that this, in their whole life, so the fact that within 3 years, 20% of this group is going back to prison is an extremely elevated rate compared to the general population. And when does it happen? It happens, for the most part, within the first year after you've been released. So these are data that show, of all the people that end up getting convicted of something after release, when does that occur? By quarter after their release. So this is 12 quarters, 3 years. A little over 50% are convicted within the first year of release. And then it's like 27% and 22%. So it declines after that. So my conclusion from this is that however the processes work right now for rehabilitation and reentry and release, I don't believe these are the intended results. So they don't seem to be producing the intended results. So do programs make an impact? I mean, we're going to be talking about programs that we do. And the state reports broadly on these in 3 categories: cognitive behavioral programs, technical trade programs, and educational programs. And in all of them, the competence intervals are there. If they did anything cognitive behavioral, they did anger management, criminal thinking, family, substance abuse things, similarly broken down for the other categories. And in general, any of those makes a difference. It corresponds with a reduced risk of being convicted within the first 3 years post-release. It's not a huge difference. Getting an AA degree is associated with a very significant decline in risk. But the rest of the programs, it changes the post-release odds from about 1 in 2 to about 1 in 3. So it definitely makes an impact, doesn't eliminate the elevation of the post-release conviction rate. So where are these prisons? Well, they're mostly in the Central Valley section. There are a few in Northern California. There are a few in the desert in the south and southeast part of California. There are a few on the outskirts of LA, but for the most part, they're in the middle part of the state. There are 32 of them. There's one scheduled to close in March next year. 96% of the people incarcerated there are men, and it's about 116% of design capacity is the current prison population. We've been to 8 of them, the ones that are in red around the state, and we are tracking that. And I have a little saying I always tell my kids, if you're not measuring, you're just screwing around. So we're keeping track of it on a bingo card we made that is on our fridge. Where did we go? With which group did we go? And when did we go? So we've been to 8. There's 24 to go. There's 3 more we plan to see in August. One's a repeat. And if anybody's interested in a bingo card, let me know. Macro just prints out a different one every time. So a couple other things about this landscape of incarceration, particularly in California. One is that there are significant changes, efforts, and work being done to shift the model of incarceration to what's called the California model, which is a more rehabilitative focused model. A lot of learnings taken from Scandinavia and other places, and to install into California prisons the kind of best practices that lead to better outcomes while incarcerated, and in particular after having been incarcerated. So it's an opening for work to be done in prison on improving the system. And one of the things that we certainly see all the time when we visit is the introduction of tablets. So these special tablets, and it's part of the whole prison industrial complex, the people that make the tablets and write the software and charge the texting fees and all that. But it really is, I think, something that is impactful in that it makes connection back to the community, back to the family, much more routine and accessible for people that are incarcerated to have tablets. They can take courses from it. It's sort of a portal to help them connect to the world and work on things that are valuable for them to work on before they return. And it's done in a way that CDCR is comfortable with safety and security. So there's a whole bunch of sort of observations, and those observations, I think, inform a lot of the context we have for the work we do in prison. Mass incarceration, my conclusion is it's unnecessary, expensive, and not very effective. There remains very profound racial disparity in how incarceration is applied, certainly at least as it turns out. The post-release conviction and return to prison rate is very much elevated compared to the rest of the population. And California CDCR, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, is very, I believe, hard at work on improving outcomes. And they are communicating about it, and I think it's being thoughtfully and aggressively pursued. And from talking to them, the California prison residents are noticing the difference. So that's the background that is going on as we started our last year going to prisons. I'll turn it over to Judy.
So there are other voices that have informed our view. We mentioned Johnny Mora and how that led to the development of the conference that we did in November 2022 that I think many of you have attended. There were other mileposts along the way. For example, in 2020, we had noticed that was when the George Floyd killing happened, and it came after a number of very high-profile police killings, and we had then invited a speaker to come talk to us from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and that was in July 2020. And LEAP's message was, and their mission is to unite and mobilize the voice of law enforcement in support of drug policy and criminal justice reform, promoting alternatives to arrest and incarceration by addressing the root cause of crime, ending the war on drugs, looking beyond the criminal justice system for a range of solutions to address society's ills and better protect human rights, reduce violence, reduce addiction, and build public respect and trust in law enforcement. And this was very interesting to hear his voice and the voice of speaking for the voice of other law enforcement current and previous officers. That was something that made an impact in my noticing and paying attention to what's going on in criminal justice reform and in prisons. Also, at that time, I was invited to do an interview on a local radio station, October 21st, 2020. And to get ready for it, I listened to the same program the week before. and they were interviewing Dr. Bonnie Paul, who's a Santa Barbara resident with this Freedom to Choose project. They go inside prisons and do prison programming. And so that was another kind of brick in the wall of me starting to pay attention in this area of prisons and prison reform. Also at that time, our daughter Samantha was in law school at UCLA, and one of the most highly respected prison law experts in the nation, Sharon Dolovich, was Samantha's professor in her prison policy and procedures course. And so there's a whole approach at UCLA and looking at and a focus on prison law. Sharon Dolovich says that she wants to shift the approach for training lawyers from a front-end approach where they focus on investigation, prosecution, and verdict to a holistic one that encompasses the back-end criminal punishment. And her quote is, "I want every future lawyer who comes to law school to know prisons are something they should care about." And in Samantha's third year, Samantha was chief managing editor for Law Review, and her partner, Maya Chowdhury, was chief executive editor. They decided to put together, I guess Maya instigated it, a law review on jailhouse lawyering. So people in prison maybe don't have funds to have a lawyer to support their appeals and so on, do their own lawyering, and they wrote all the articles for this law review, which may have been the first one ever written by jailhouse lawyers, so to speak. Just wanted to mention that in Sharon Dolovich's class, she talks a little bit about the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery, but neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So involuntary servitude is okay right now, according to the 13th Amendment in prisons. And there is an Ava DuVernay documentary available on Netflix called The 13th, which I recommend watching. The other amendment they talk about in prison law, of course, spending most of the time on the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, which says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments. And so then we get to the conference we did in 2022, which was a tremendous educational opportunity for me. We had the lead psychiatrist for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Michael Golding, speaking as a private citizen, talking about his views of physical and mental health in prison. And the thing that I got from his talk is volunteers make a difference. The programs that come into the prisons make a difference on an individual basis. And he said, and it's safe to go in there. You're going to be safer there than you are, walking down the streets of Santa Barbara. It's safe to go in there. It makes a difference. And he encouraged everybody to volunteer. We also had several people speak, such as John Guy and Lawrence Larry, who were previously incarcerated, talking about the difference that program made for them in their success and their rehabilitation and successfully returning to society. We had a professor from Drexel University talking about how the U.S. is adopting some of these Scandinavian principles of humanity in the design of their prisons. And one of those prisons is called Little Scandinavia in Chester, Pennsylvania. And the superintendent of that prison spoke to us about the work that they are doing in Chester, Pennsylvania. And then we had a professor from Norway come in and talk about that even though their system's pretty good, that there's still a ways to go. In the afternoon, we had a number of other speakers. Fritzi Horstman from Compassion Prison Project spoke. This is one of the programs that we ended up volunteering with. Very impressed by what their group does in looking at the effect and the impact of childhood trauma on the development of a child's brain and the way they respond to different circumstances in life. Dr. Andy Thompson is a psychiatrist talking about also the impact of trauma and also how we may not have all the choices that we think we have based on the environment that we may have experienced. And also freedom to choose. We invited them to speak, and one of their volunteers, who also happens to be our realtor, she spoke, as well as one of their clients, Benny Gutierrez, about the impact that Freedom to Choose had, which has been around for about 20 years, plus other speakers on reentry and on other groups. I wanted to bring this back to, this is a Humanist Society meeting, so what does all this have to do with humanism? I pulled up these 10 commitments, Living Humanist Values, that's published by the American Humanist Association. And some of the commitments that fit in very nicely with this work is the one on peace and social justice. It says, I will help people solve problems and handle disagreements in ways that are fair for everyone. Service and participation. I will help my community in ways that let me get to know the people I'm helping. And empathy. I will consider other people's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. So let's get to talk a little bit about our actual volunteer work in prison with the Compassion Prison Project and the Freedom to Choose Project. During the conference, we heard a lot about these adverse childhood experiences and the impact on the developing brain and in the way then that you react to different stress and circumstances as a teenager and as an adult. 10 specific traumatic childhood experiences are linked to a higher likelihood of health challenges, likelihood increases of having those challenges with the number of these ACEs that you have as child experiences, and incarcerated people have much, much higher ACE scores than the general population. The 10 ACEs were defined as the following types of experiences: physical, sexual, verbal abuse, physical, emotional neglect, separation, divorce, abandonment, or death of a parent, a family member with mental illness or one who attempts or commits suicide, a family member addicted to drugs or alcohol, a family member who is in prison, witnessing a parent being abused. And all of these things fall into the ACE quiz. And ACEs can be used as a tool for building resilience, because trauma, once recognized, can be addressed through the neuroplasticity of the brain. So here's an example. This is the Compassion Prison Project and how they deal with evaluating these ACEs. So when we go in with Compassion Prison Project, there's our leader, Fritzi Horstman. She'll have all of the volunteers and the prison residents stand in a big circle. And then she starts reading off the 10 questions of these ACEs and says, for each question, if your answer is yes, take a step inside the circle. And she reads the first question and then the second question, and people are taking steps. And for each step, I swear, half to 2/3 of the people seem to take a step. Not the volunteers, we're still standing in the back. Few of these apply to us, but for the incarcerated people, many of them apply. I also want to say that these are voluntary programs. So this isn't a statistically randomized sample of people who are incarcerated. These are the people who are actively working on addressing the behaviors that got them into the situation in the first place, actively addressing the issues so that they can be free again one day. So this is typically what happens at the end of the 10 questions. They've all taken steps into the circle, and from being this big circle, now you have a cluster of people in the center who have all taken these many steps. And invariably, one of them will share that what something they noticed is that at the beginning, our trauma kept us apart. You don't share about your trauma in prison to other prisoners, you got to act tough. But acknowledging their trauma brought them together as a community of human beings. So I thought it might be interesting for you all to take the ACE quiz and see how many you have. So I'm just going to bring the questions up one at a time. If your answer is yes, just keep track of it on your fingers on a sheet of paper and see how many ACEs you have compared to the typical 8 to 10 that we see in the residents of these prisons. So first, before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Second, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? 3, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you, or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other? They didn't feel close to each other or support each other. Number 4, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, You had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it. Number 5, did you lose a parent through divorce, abandonment, death, or other reason before your 18th birthday? 6, was your parent or caregiver, were they often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them? Or were they sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or were they ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Number 7, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? 8, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? 9, did a household member go to prison? And 10, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Those are the 10 questions. And I would invite anyone who feels comfortable, put your number in the chat as far as how many aces you have. But what we tend to find is that the volunteers are way into the low end of the scale, and that the incarcerated residents, the participants in these programs, are up in the 7, 8, 9, 10 range.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the moments labeled unforgettable moments, but they're sort of the significant moments where either we were impacted by it or we saw that it had a big impact on the participants. So this one happened my first visit, my first day, my first time doing the step inside the circle. And it was actually the first time I'd even taken the ACE quiz. I'd seen the video, but I hadn't really gone through it. And so as she's going through them, I'm listening to them. And at the end of it, I didn't have any of them. And so I was standing out at the edges of the circle, and all the participants were in the middle. And one of them called me out and said, "Hey, you're out there like you're a zero. Nobody's a zero. You should be braver or be honest and come on in here and acknowledge your aces." From my perspective, it was like, oh, I wish I had some aces. It's separating me from everybody. But I look honestly, I don't have them. And so he was convinced that in his experience of the world, there was not a way for somebody to grow up and not have any aces, which I hadn't really, it's kind of conceptually I had that idea, but to actually see it come out is it's just not in his universe that could be true. So later on, he and I, as it turned out, we were doing one exercise where we're talking to each other about things. I don't remember particularly which exercise it was, but it came up that my dad had plenty of aces. His alcoholic father and committed suicide and basically abandoned by his mother, and he had lots of aces. But it stopped. Sorry, so he stopped it. And what makes that powerful, I think, in the prison is the presence is for the people participating, that it can stop. It doesn't have to be passed down again and again and again as it was to them. So anyhow, it's a chance I always have to acknowledge my dad for that.
Yeah, and you had the opportunity to do that before he passed away earlier this year.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that he had all those aces and your sister and you are zeros. So yeah, very inspiring. Yeah. So after they do the trauma circle, it could get a little heavy, just like Dave looking at this situation. And so what Fritzy does is she lightens the mood by leading us all in this playful call and response song and dance. So it's not all heavy. There's some fun in the day as well. But then we get to work learning about the impact of trauma on a child's brain development, and more importantly, learning skills and techniques to self-regulate and to heal.
A couple other unforgettable moments. One thing that's true is that there are always correctional officers. COs is a correctional officer. And so they're always around because they're, supposed to be watching what's going on. And so on occasion, they participate. And absolutely, invariably, they are in the same range of trauma in terms of how many ACEs they have as the incarcerated participants. I didn't expect that. And at the women's prison, the lieutenant, who's not the warden, but kind of at the level below the warden, participated in several of the exercises and talked to us. And it was actually it was very impressive that she was taking the time to get this involved in this program. And as she was talking about it, she said, yeah, in my family, half the people are incarcerated and the other half are in law enforcement. And I hadn't understood, would not have predicted that it seems that they both may be responses to trauma. So prison can be this crazy world where you have a bunch of traumatized people on both sides of it, traumatizing each other while they're there. So CPP has actually now started to do the whole trauma talks curriculum with COs as a way to reduce the violence that happens in prison. And then the other one, this one-on-one being with exercise. So there's an exercise that's always very powerful that we do. We kind of build up to it, where you just sit quietly and you look into the eyes of the person across from you. It's a one-on-one exercise, and you just look them in the eye, and you don't say anything, and you don't look away, and you're just being with each other, which is very, very activating for many people, and especially for the incarcerated people, because looking somebody in the eye is challenging or threatening. It can be misinterpreted in prison in dangerous ways. But by this point in the program, they're participating, and so we do it. So I had a gentleman about my age across from me, and we started looking at each other's eyes, and he just started crying. Tears started coming out of his eyes. And we just sat there, that's the exercise. And then at the end, you talk to each other about how did it, what did you see or what did you notice? And he just started talking and told me the story of how he was a kid and how he got to prison and how terrified he was and how he was threatened all the time, and he had to strategize about not getting attacked. And I had to pick a location for the fight, so I went up to this tier because it was dangerous. I could, throw him off the tier if I got in trouble. And I have kids, and my wife or my partner has come for conjugal visits and have these kids, and I've never seen them. And I've been here for 40 years, and I don't know if I'm ever going to get out. And it just went on. And in fact, Fritzy was chirping at us because she said, "What's going on over there? We've moved on from that. Keep going." But he just, my interpretation was that his life had been so devoid of connection and sort of authentic expression of himself for so long that once it cracked open, the dam broke, and he just wanted to get it all out. So it was very moving and very, it felt very healing for him to be sort of back in the land of the humans and out of the land of the, that you can be forced into, the shell you're forced into in prison.
So Fritzy gives us an opportunity at these events to take a microphone and introduce ourselves and let people know who we are and how we got involved with this work. And one of the things that I notice when they are talking about what happened to them as a kid, when Fritzy's talking about what 2-year-old deserves to be hit or slapped, I think about our grandson. This is our grandson. And I look around the room and I can imagine, typically we're in men's prisons, all of these men as 2-year-olds, as precocious little cute as a button 2-year-olds. And I think about that they were somebody's grandson. And I tell them that. I said, I see you all as the cute 2-year-old that you once were. And then there was in one of our events after the walls break down and we're willing to be authentic and vulnerable with each other, there was a gentleman, incarcerated dad, at the end of the day who raised his hand and said that there was something that he wanted to share with the group. And there was about 100 people there. And one thing to know in prison is that there's a pecking order, there's a hierarchy, and the people at the very bottom of the pecking order is anyone who's ever harmed a child. And so you don't want people to know that that's what you did. And what this gentleman shared, haltingly and very remorsefully, is that the crime that he was in for was that he had an 18-month-old son, and one day the son was crying and screaming, and he couldn't control it, and he was angry, and he tapped the kid, thumped him on his chest, I think are the words he used, and the baby died. And he was inconsolable. And the whole room, you could have heard a pin drop. Everyone felt the pain that he was going through. And I also was really struck by his courage to share this horrifying moment that he said he can never get over. And then there was an older gentleman in the circle who kind of said something to the effect of, you're going to be okay. Something like that. And the way we interpreted that was someone from the group speaking that, whereas generally these people who hurt child are in danger in prisons, they were going to, as a group, as his brothers, going to look out for him. And it was a very, very moving moment. There's also exercises that we do one-on-one where it's about acknowledging our common humanity. Fritzy does this exercise called If You Spot It, You Got It, where we're looking at that we all have things that we can work on in ourselves. Often they're the things that most annoy us about other people. Take a look and see if that might be something that people criticize you for. I certainly noticed those things. And also we're asked to just look at someone that we don't even know and come up with 5 things that we can acknowledge or admire them for. And it's surprisingly easy to do. And then she also points out, hey, if you spot it, you got it. Take a look and see if maybe those are good qualities in yourself. So we see both our common humanity, things that are good about ourselves, and things that we can work on, and that we all have those. Unforgettable moment, 17 to 71. This was my first or second time visiting and talking to a gentleman who told me that he has been incarcerated since he was 17 years old for a crime he committed earlier as a teenager, and he was currently 71 years old. And that he'd been in prison all that time, and that he wasn't the same person he was at 17. Who is the same person now that they were at 17? And so it had me think about, but the thing that he did is the thing that he's known for. And made me think, well, what is the worst thing I've ever done? What's the worst thing any of you have ever done in your life? And imagine being defined by that thing in your past for the rest of your life, regardless of the circumstances at the time, regardless of your growth and development since then, regardless of any amends you may have made or your future potential. Again, it just helps connect humanity to humanity. And then there's Mr. Robinson. So at one of these events, there's a gentleman in a wheelchair, and one of the exercises that we do is everybody's in a big circle, and then we're told to just walk across the circle simultaneously to the other side as fast as you can, not making eye contact or anything. And he didn't want to do this because he's in a wheelchair and it was not going to work too well, and he just wanted to sit back and watch. And I'm like, come on, Mr. Robinson, here, I'll help you. I'll help you with your wheelchair. And so he reluctantly agreed. And so we did this exercise, and every time you walk back and forth, there's more intimacy. The first time you don't acknowledge anybody, the second time you look at some people in the eyes, the third time you say hello, like that, gradually getting more comfortable with being with people. And then we went on to other exercises during the day, and I checked in with him at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, I sat down with him, and he, like Dave had talked about his experience, just wanted to talk. He wanted to tell me about his heart condition, about how he was going in for surgery Friday, about how frightened he was. that he had a release date the following year, that he was afraid about being released, and he just wanted to, and then Fritzy's saying, come on, we got to go. We got to be out of here by 3:30. And Mr. Robinson just wanted to talk. So it feels like I'm getting such a gift in being let into kind of the privacy of their world, and that just by listening can make a difference. Okay. This one was kind of funny. Okay. So this is another exercise that is done with Compassion Prison Project. We have groups of 8 and everybody has 3 minutes to say, if you really knew me, you'd know that. And sometimes when I did these, it was a little superficial, talking about how many cousins I had, or I'm from Buffalo, stuff like that. And this time I thought, well, let me look and see what I'd really like them to know. And so what I shared with them is that I had this dog, Moose. There's Moose there. And Moose had been very ill, and we had to put Moose down. And Dave then said, oh, well, we've had a dog for 10 years. So now let's not have a dog for 10 years. And I was like, all right, that's fair. But, and then my daughter got involved and said, maybe mom should have a dog. You really wanted to be happy. And Dave, because he's a great guy, said, all right, yeah, I'll support that. And I shared that with these guys. And my 3 minutes were up and it went on to the next person. Well, at the end of this whole round, Fritzy asked people to share, and different groups shared, and then a guy from our group stood up, got the microphone, looked over at Dave, pointed at him, and said, Dave, we in this group are so glad that you're letting Judy get a dog, and next time you're here, we want to see pictures of the dog, and it just kind of really, that they would care about whether or not I would have a dog, and make such a fuss over it, just really touched my heart. Yeah, and we don't have another dog yet, but we've got one visiting. So, all right.
All right, and I think the last one, I've been thinking about how to articulate this well, but it is so clear, and again, something I didn't anticipate, that having people come and spend their time of the day with people, interacting with them as peers is just another person, not interacting with them as their crime or an incarcerated person or somebody who needs to be checked out and monitored, and listening to what they have to say and being empathetic makes a huge impact. And when we go around the room at the end and talk about it, invariably, half the people talk about how it's been the most impactful thing they've done since they've been in prison. And it's I don't know, it's such a high return activity for me. I can go in there, drive some hours to the middle of nowhere where there's a prison, spend 6 hours with 100 people, and impact most of them, if not all of them, in a way that's pretty profound. And that's what they say. This is the picture on the right is from a graduation where a group at the prison in Lancaster had gone through the whole curriculum of trauma talks, and for the graduation they were allowed to bring their family in, and this is one of the guys' family. But to see that impact beyond the guys in prison to their families and their communities makes it worth the drive.
One of the things that I've noticed at the work with Compassion Prison Project and with Freedom to Choose is that it kind of shifts the way I think about things, from bad people hurt people to no, hurt people, and healed people can heal people. Another one is shifting from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and shifting from prisons as places that traumatize the already traumatized to a glimmer of hope, perhaps, that prisons can be centers of healing and transformation. Fritzy often asks in her talks, how many of you would be dead if you weren't in prison? And invariably, it's a third to a half of them raise their hand. And a sense of shifting from you are the problem, maybe you are the solution in terms of interrupting the cycle of recidivism, interrupting the generational transmission of trauma in the community, supporting and treating recovery from addiction, both inside and outside the communities. So it's a real shift, and I see a big opportunity in the incarcerated population. A little bit about Freedom to Choose. We haven't worked with them as much as with Compassion Prison Project. We've been on one of their visits, but it happened to be their 20th anniversary visit to Valley State Prison. But they're also about power of redemption, power of second chances, and Santa Barbara residents, Dr. David Paul and Dr. Bonnie Paul, are the co-founders, and they are basing their work on Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And the quote there is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So if something happens, instead of automatically reacting, can you take a step back? Do you have tools to take a step back and consider what your response should be? Those of you in Santa Barbara may have noticed last week, Freedom to Choose was featured on the cover of the Santa Barbara Independent in an article called Good Things Come in Trios, How Prisoners Find Freedom Behind Bars. And in that article, there was a picture of the 20th anniversary, and Dave and I just happened to show up on that day. And so this is outside Valley State Prison, all the volunteers that came in for that day with our pictures circled. What's different about Freedom to Choose is they have one volunteer for every 2 incarcerated people. So if they're having 200 incarcerated people come to a program, they have 100 or more volunteers. They're very impressive, very well organized, and they have this saying, we are so flexible, because going into prisons, it seems like the rules are always different. What you think it was supposed to be, it's going to be something different. Things change. You got to be flexible to keep moving forward. They use a process of trios where they have 3 people, a volunteer and 2 incarcerated people in a group of 3, and you take on roles. One's the facilitator asking questions that they give us to ask. Then there's a sharer who answers the question in an open and honest way, and a neutral observer who's listening quietly in a caring, non-judgmental way. So there was a trio exercise that I thought I would maybe share with you, in that the trio exercise was the facilitator would ask me to describe an upsetting situation I experienced. How did I feel when it happened? What was my opinion about it? What were the facts? What's another way to think about it? And how does the new story make you feel? It's kind of practicing and recontextualizing or reinterpreting things that happen in life. And I was trying to come up with an upsetting situation that had happened recently. And the only one I could think of was that I had recently been on a long 48-hour travel journey from Nepal. We went to a wedding in Nepal, and on the way back, I was very sick, and I was in a center seat, and the people on either side of me were hogging the armrests. And I was so irritated, and I couldn't get comfortable. And I thought, I can't share that. That just sounds so, they're in prison, and here I am complaining about a center seat flying home from Nepal, But it's the only thing I could come up with in that moment. And so, I took a chance and I shared that. And the person who was listening, he says, and his reflection was, I completely get that. He goes, there are so many unwritten rules in prison. My cellie leaves his stuff on my top bunk, and he should know that he only needs to put things on his bunk and not on my bunk. And it was completely analogous to the armrest situation. So I bring it up that even, again, it's about finding that common, or noticing that common humanity. So I would like to acknowledge some of the learnings that I've had in this journey from outside sources. I have to acknowledge my sister-in-law, Jennifer Flattery, who's here, who told me about this podcast, Ear Hustle. Please listen to Ear Hustle. Find it. There's 100 episodes of it. It started being published in May 2017. Earlonne Woods and Nigel Poor lead this. Earlonne, this is in San Quentin Prison, first podcast ever created and produced from within a prison. Earlonne is now out, and it's just amazing. Ear hustle means eavesdropping in prison lingo, so that's where the name comes from. But highly recommend listening to Ear Hustle. Also, there are a number of books that I've read recently which were impactful. Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Her book's about restorative justice, an alternative to mass incarceration for violent offenders. Restorative justice, I'd always heard the term but didn't know what it meant. And what she talks about is there's another way if both the offender and the victim are willing to go through this process, that the offender can fully acknowledge responsibility over their action, can acknowledge the impact that their actions had on others, express genuine remorse, And the fourth step is doing sorry, meaning taking action to repair the harm, guided if possible by the people who are harmed by the action, and committing to no longer commit the same behavior. Excellent, excellent book. Also a book by Harvard professor Bruce Western called Homeward, about what factors have reentry into society be more or less successful. He looked at a group released from Massachusetts prisons in the Boston area. Body Keeps the Score, Boston-based psychiatrist, trauma researcher. This is the book that inspired Fritzy to learn about trauma, look at her own trauma, and take the bold move of taking it into prisons. And then finally, Sparrow and the Razor Wire. This is Quan Huynh in the LA area, his personal story of his trauma growing up, his criminality, incarceration, those kind of moments of truth, turning points during his incarceration, acceptance, freedom, and then contributing to others. 4 books I would recommend. And then there's these great documentaries. The 50, I see that Peg is on here. So the 50 is about a program at San Quentin in around 2006 where they took 50 lifers and started training them to be drug and alcohol counselors. And are now and this program now has expanded to, I believe, all of the prisons in the California system. And they are sought after, and upon release are getting great jobs, making a huge difference. One of them said, "We are experts in the field when it comes to loneliness, hurt, and pain. If we had the right support, the right love and acknowledgement, the right education and therapy, we could ultimately become the greatest healers of our society." And Peg tells us that that is true. Ferguson Rises, wonderful movie. What I liked about that documentary, it talks about what happened at Ferguson with Michael Brown, and it looks at it from all different perspectives, and see that everybody in all different perspectives are all human, all ultimately capable of growth and healing, and something to learn from them. Skid Row Marathon. I see Tracy's on here. She knows what this movie's all about. This is LA Criminal Court Judge Craig Mitchell. And what he says in the movie is that he just kind of knows the same people kind of cycling through his court and thought, what else can he do? He was a runner, so he went down to Skid Row, started a running club with a group of unhoused and some formerly incarcerated people. They run international marathons, and just hearing some of their stories, very inspiring. The First Step, Van Jones, a journalist. During the Trump administration, he saw an opening to work across party lines on some landmark criminal justice reform legislation and humane responses to the addiction crisis, specifically in looking at the mandatory sentences for crack cocaine and powder cocaine are way different. And, there's a rich versus poor element there. So very good movie, First Step. Finally, 26.2 to Life, you see, is at the Santa Barbara Film Festival. That's another San Quentin program where a gentleman came in and started a 1,000-mile running club, and they have a marathon within the prison that is absolutely transformative. Got a lot of time to think when you're running 1,000 miles. Also, I see Neil's on the call today. Neil was an attendee at our last conference and has taken it on, and I'm working with him. A number of us are working together to put on another conference. Saturday, November 23rd, we're going to have it be our humanist meeting for the month of November. And the conference purpose is, the title is Prisons to Partnerships. Exploring what life is like for people in prison and after release, highlighting programs and initiatives that successfully prepare and support people in their rehabilitation and reintegration, offering opportunities to partner by promoting meaningful dialogues. There'll be more opportunities to talk to each other than what we have here today, and inspiring people to support the programs that make a difference, reducing recidivism, promoting social justice, and transforming lives. So we're hoping you're going to get involved. We urge you. Now's the time. Things are changing. Things are heading in the right direction. There's some support out there. You can donate time or money. We certainly can support Compassion Prison Project, Freedom to Choose Project. There's many other great projects out there. You can volunteer time. You can go into prisons. You can also, there's work you can do from home. They have correspondence courses. They need people to kind of grade papers. There's writings to incarcerated men and women. There's administrative work. that can be done. So if you're interested in any of that, please contact those organizations. Learning, these are the things that I was listening to and reading. Interested in anything else anybody else recommends, there's just a wealth of information out there and some very exciting activities going on. And invite you to attend Prison of Possibilities in November. Also, be an advocate, support effective programs and policies that interrupt that cycle of incarceration, support programs and initiatives and policies that are supporting from a punishment model to a rehabilitation or transformation model. And please share your learnings with others in your networks. And with that, I thank you all for attending this talk. Linda?
Yes, I just want to make a couple of points. When they did that survey for black to white proportions that go to prison, my question is it there a difference, let's say, between white woman and black woman proportion to white man and black man proportion?
Yeah, so I don't know. I think those data are in there. I haven't split it by gender and race. This is just overall the genders combined, or the numbers that I'm reporting.
Yeah.
So it's going to be dominated by males, right? Because in the U.S., at least about 96% of the incarcerated people are male.
Yeah. I did watch a documentary. It's called The 13th. It's about specifically this thing. And they were saying that 1 out of 3 black men go to prison?
Yeah, I found the source document for that, which was written in 2011 by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that modeled out, given the rate of incarceration, which was near our U.S. peak, that they modeled, if that played out, how likely would the cohort, I think, of black men born in 2001 would be to go to prison. It was 32%, is what the model said. 32% of the black male population would go to prison at least once in their lifetime.
Yeah. Okay. Have you ever heard of the Ironwood State Prison College program? I think in Nevada, if I'm not mistaken, it's in Nevada or Nebraska. I'm not sure which one. They have a program where they're taking wild horses and they're getting prisoners to tame them so they can learn how to be ranch hands.
Yeah, I know there's also dog programs where they're training dogs. Yeah. So an incarcerated person gets a dog to train and then gives them to a veteran with PTSD and other types of programs like that. And in some of the prisons that we've gone into, there have been dogs sitting there by the resident. So, yeah, those are wonderful programs. Yeah. There's so many great programs. There's a lot of great programs.
I remember watching a comedy a long time ago. It was kind of like one of these 1950s. And it was about a guy who was a real, kind of like a charming kind of con man, you know, like, and he gets out of prison and he's talking to it. He says, yeah, and then when I get out of prison, I commit a crime so I can get back into prison and be with my friends, right? And I know it was like it's supposed to be a comedy, but I think it kind of makes a point too, that sometimes maybe some of these criminals, when they go out, they subconsciously want to get caught so they can go back to prison because the outer world is too much, like the freedom is too much for them to handle because they become institutionalized in their minds.
Yeah, if they're not adequately prepared and set up for success, it can be a pretty scary place. Like Mr. Robinson was telling me and how Johnny has told me, you know, he's like, what am I going to do when I get out?
Yeah.
Work at a bowling alley. I'm like, I don't know, there aren't that many bowling alleys around anymore. So programming is so important, and having a plan. Yeah.
I heard a really good description on someone who couldn't handle freedom. It was Ariane Hersey, right? And she had a sister who eventually escaped from, you know, and she came to Holland with Ariane Hersey, you know, like the famous
Ariane Hersey,
what do you call, horsewoman. And the sister made a very interesting description of what it was like to have all that Western freedom suddenly given to her. She said it felt like being in the house where the walls were dissolving.
Thank you, Linda, for your comments.
My name is Jason. I am out of Houston, Texas. I am a prison ministry volunteer as well. Only I've been inside 18 different units of the 100 that are out here in Texas and participated in a dozen or so programs. One of the programs I participated in is called the Prison Entrepreneurship Program. I'm not sure if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
When I remember participating in an exercise with that was reminded me of what you described of your ACEs exercise. It was called Step to the Line. And basically how it works is you've got a room with the volunteers on one side of the room and the inmates on the other side of the room. And you ask a question, a very simple question. How many of you, when you woke up this morning, had a cup of coffee, step to the line? Right. And everybody who had coffee steps to the line. You shake hands with the volunteers and the inmates shake hands. Right. And you get into some more serious questions. How many of you grew up and had your lights turned off because your folks couldn't pay the power bill? Right. Step to the line. Right. And so basically what came out of that was really a kind of a unifying sense of that. Although you have the volunteers on one side of the room and the inmates on the other side of the room, we really have a lot more in common than what meets the eye. So I wasn't sure if you had heard of that exercise, and if not, it might be something also good to practice, just again to bring that sense of unity when you're inside with the men.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks.
Jason.
Yeah, that's exactly encapsulates my experience. There's way more we have in common than what we think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for attending, and looking forward to seeing you next time.